Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the City Update. I'm your host, Mark Aaron, Multimedia Design Manager for the City of Danville. On this week's episode, we're down on Bridge Street in the heart of the River District. As many of you are aware, in 2011, the city worked on a master plan for this area, and we're actually going to start some of those implementing some of those ideas within that plan. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the City Update. I'm your host, Mark Aaron, Multimedia Design Manager for the City of Danville. Today, we're down on Bridge Street in the heart of the River District here in the City of Danville. And as most of you are aware, in 2011, the city worked closely with two consultants in developing a master plan for this area. And we are glad to say that we are getting ready to implement some of those ideas within that plan in early 2012. And on today's show, we're going to talk with Allison Platt, who was one of the entities in help developing that plan in 2011. And she's going to be discussing a design guide that we'll be creating here for the River District. This will be a manual for individuals that will be building new constructions in the area, even a guide for existing buildings, all the way down to the sidewalks and streetscapes in the River District. We want to create a great quality of life and a seamless transition as you roll through this district. So this design guide will kind of be a manual for that. On today's show, we'll talk with Allison Platt. She gave a presentation recently to the community at the Pepsi building here at the crossing at the Dan. You'll see that presentation in its entirety. And of course, we want your feedback and input on this plan. So feel free to give us a call at the Office of the City Managers or shoot us an email and give us your ideas after you see her presentation. If you like more information, you can give us a call as well. It would be great to hear from you and also provide you some more insight if you need it. So let's take you out now to the Pepsi building. We'll hear from Allison Platt.
Usually when you see design guidelines, it'll be like the ones that you have for the, what's it called, the Old West End. And that's more traditional design guidelines where you're mostly dealing with residential structures. River District is a little different because you have mostly commercial and industrial buildings. So they'll be structured a little bit differently. But the thing that I'd like you to understand at the outset is if we enact these design guidelines, basically what you're doing is you're instructing people about how to rehab buildings and what's important in historic preservation and new buildings and signage and a lot of things. But it's basically going to impose some standards on the historic district, and it'll mean that people have to meet those standards. So it does have some requirements, and it's something good to keep in mind as we go through. So let's get started. Obviously, we finished the plan, and private and public projects have been defined and have been prioritized, and of course you're already moving forward on some of those, and the city is already working with some private investors in addition to the public projects that we've defined. And if you didn't see it, this is the master plan, but we won't spend a lot of time on it, great though it was. And then if we focus in on Main Street, we did set this up as the first priority because things are going perhaps a little bit stronger in the Tobacco Warehouse District. There's a lot of new businesses coming in and projects like that. But Main Street, especially when I started on this project, there's a lot of vacancies on Main Street. And so it's very important, it being the commercial heart of your downtown, for that to start working again. So it's a good reason to start on Main Street. And then, of course, after Main Street's done, we'll look at the 100% corner here, which of course is this block here, and then eventually, hopefully, a park by the river. What's going to guide the development? Is it just going to happen, whoever has money is going to build something and they can build whatever they want? Well, we hope not. Zoning already has a way of establishing the minimum standards for any use, and that's, of course, already in place in the River District. The River District Plan does establish short and long-term goals for public and private investment, although it doesn't really talk that much about what these buildings should look like. Federal guidelines for historic preservation are a great financial incentive for redevelopment of historic properties. And that's always in place. If you're in a historic district, whether you have design guidelines or not, you can still get tax credits for your buildings. But what design guidelines does is it establishes goals and objectives of development and public improvements, and it usually is enacted through an overlay zone or something like that, and it's administered through a commission that does approvals for changes to buildings. So design guidelines are a manual for those wishing to improve their properties. It shows appropriate materials, it outlines procedures and process, and demonstrates expectations. which generally are going to be higher than they are other places in the city. It's a demonstration of commitment to quality development, both public and private, by the city. It covers not only building restoration and renovation, but standards for new development, site standards, and public improvements. So basically it covers all the bases. In most cases, the standards will be higher, as I said, for this district than they will for the other parts of the city, because zoning basically sets up the minimum standards for development, which is kind of the floor. I mean, you have to meet these standards in order to build something. But what design guidelines does is it sets the goals, which would be the ceiling. This is what we want our district to be. What design guidelines are not is site-specific design. We don't deal with a particular property and what happens with that particular property. We set up rules that would apply across the area. They are not laws. They can be enacted by giving approvals for a certificate of appropriateness for a change, but they're not laws. They're an interpretation of laws. They're modifiers and guides. How will they work? In most communities, historic district commissions are established and permits will only be issued if the property meets the design standards by review of a commission. With historic districts, the guidelines work with federal and state tax incentives to ensure preservation. And utilizing a carrot and stick strategy, the city can make facade grants and offer other assistance available for properties that meet the guidelines. In most cities where you do have incentive grants, a certificate of appropriateness must be issued before they're eligible for these grants. And so that's a great carrot and stick for most people who are purchasing buildings and improving them. And site guidelines are also an important part of it because a site can really ruin an otherwise nice building. What will they accomplish? We know what historic preservation accomplishes. It's a great economic development tool. Zoning and other tax incentives also help with renovation, but these are only part of the district's revitalization. For the River District to become very successful again, all the different entities that are part of the district have to play a part, and that is not only historic buildings, but new buildings, new businesses and attractions, attractive streets, parks and amenities, attractive and functional wayfinding and private signage, sidewalk dining, well-ordered vehicular access and parking, and places designed for the comfort and enjoyment primarily of people. In a downtown district where you want to attract people, really, you want to park those cars and get people to walk. You don't want it to be primarily for vehicles. So incentives can help make all this happen. In most communities, guidelines cover a specific area with similar architecture and use. That's the wrong name for it, but the downtown district and the Tobacco Warehouse district are two other historic districts. In the River District, that's a little harder because although there are two historic districts that fall at least partially or mostly within the River District, there's also a lot of other areas that are not as well defined. One of the first issues to be addressed will be how best to focus the guidelines. In many guidelines, you have sub-districts and have different rules for the sub-districts. And this is something I'd like you all to comment and think with me about. And then the other way to do it is building types. And in general, with existing buildings, my tendency is to think that we should not do it by districts, but by building types. And the reason for that is, if you think about like Main Street, there's a lot of commercial buildings on Main Street, but if you go off Main Street a little bit, there's industrial buildings. For instance, if you go down Floyd Street, there's industrial buildings down there, but they don't really connect directly with the Tobacco Warehouse district. So dealing with the standards by building type rather than by district probably makes a lot of sense for design guidelines. And then there's also the issue of non-historic buildings or vacant areas, and what do you do with those in relation to a design guideline? There's also site guidelines, as I said, and there's also public areas. So in going through this exercise before I came up here today, I started to look at the different ways that the district or parts of the district are already categorized. The thick black line in this drawing is what we defined at the beginning of our redevelopment plan process as the River District. Within it, that sort of pinkish area, that's the downtown district. And then the blue area is the Tobacco Warehouse district. And then within that, there's a red-lined district, and that was something that was sort of, that I arbitrarily assigned when I did the plan as the area that should have the initial focus in the River District Plan. And the reason for that is it's a sort of an L shape that defines both the 100% corner as the knuckle, and then the Main Street area, and then the Tobacco Warehouse District, encompassing most of the historic buildings. So it seemed to me that it made sense to focus first on the historic areas and to get those up and running, because if they work, they're going to have a synergistic effect and spread the good works of the downtown outward from there. But you have to build, one of the things that's really important is you have to build a critical mass. And if you do one project over here and one project over here, sometimes it's not possible to build that critical mass. And this slide just basically talks about those issues. And then this is a land use map. So these are all the land uses that were surveyed in the district. And you can see that there's really no logical pattern. You know, some are commercial, some are office, some are vacant, some are characterized as industrial. So this would not be a good way to characterize things for design guidelines. So basically, my conclusion by looking at this map is that it would not be useful to classify buildings in a design guidelines by use. And one of the reasons for that is that uses change. And you know, especially you can see that, I think, now in the Tobacco Warehouse District. What used to be the Diamond Tobacco headquarters is now Averett University and the Regional Foundation. So if you were to say that that building was only available for industrial, well, you'd be losing out big time. So that's probably not going to work. And what I concluded from this is that uses can and do change over time, and really should, because you're in a redevelopment stage. And so basically focusing on the buildings rather than the uses is probably the way to go. This is a map that was done from the comprehensive plan, and it starts to look in a more cohesive way at the River District area. And that large area that it appears to be brown, it's really salmon on the map, but we'll call it brown, is basically downtown mixed use. Now that makes a lot more sense in terms of the River District, because that's what it is. It's a downtown area and the uses are all over the place. The area to the right and down was economic development, and that's changed somewhat, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think probably the Lavender area. I talked with Kenny this afternoon, and probably this area in here, this whole area, is probably part of just the downtown mixed-use area. That would be my inclination. This area right here is kind of undefined. There's a little of this, a little of that, so that's going to be more interesting to do. And this area over here is also a little of this and a little of that, and some what I would characterize as junk uses. So that's probably going to change over time. This may be one of the hardest ones to redefine for a lot of reasons, and we'll get with that later. So the important goals and objectives of the design guidelines are first to ensure high quality design and historic preservation. You want that to become a part of the culture so that anybody who comes here to buy a property or to fix up the property that they already own knows that the high standards have been set, and that's really an economic development tool. A lot of people these days, a lot of towns have been saying, well, you know, I don't think we want to have design standards because it's going to discourage investment. You know, people don't want to be told what to do, and I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. Because if you get a quality developer and they want to invest in a building, they want to know that the person who's got the property next to them is going to be held to the same high standard. Because why should they spend their money and invest in a building if somebody next door can build a hot dog stand? So it does make a difference, and it does work. Another thing that they can do as far as goals is it can put something in place so that you have to consider carefully before demolishing a salvageable historic building. Now, not all historic buildings, in my personal opinion, are salvageable. If they're too far degraded, if they're leaning, if nobody wants to reuse them, for anything that you can think of, then it might be time to consider another use. But in all cases, you'll want to set up something so that you have to wait a while before you demolish a building and get people's comments on it. You do need to provide architectural height materials guidelines to ensure quality infill in new development, also to ensure quality renovation. You have to more clearly outline use areas if that's appropriate. And you have to pay special attention to transition areas, like, for instance, between industrial and residential or whatever it might be. You need to provide site guidelines, and you need to reassure those who have invested already, of which there is a growing number. So this is the general outline that you would have of a publication of design guidelines. You'd have an introduction. You'd have maps that define the area and any sub-areas that you might have. You'd talk about principles, which is, preserve buildings, accessibility, pedestrian priority, those sorts of things. And you'd have specific guidelines for historic commercial buildings, historic industrial buildings, new buildings in the River District, which would be form rather than use, site design, commercial corridors, if those are going to exist, and that's a question, and streetscape and public space design, including sidewalk dining, also signage. But I'm going to take a little, usually you would deal with the historic buildings first, because mostly the design guidelines are concerned about buildings, especially historic buildings. And that'll be the case here in the long term, but we have a shorter deadline coming up on us now, which is that we're trying to get the streetscape done within a pretty short time. So I reordered this yesterday to say that we need to look probably first at some standards that will affect streetscape design and public space design. And the reason for that is it's not only, Main Street is not an isolated island. It's going to set the standard for a lot of the streetscape renovations in the entire River District. So whatever we decide as far as furniture and everything like that is going to probably be adopted for the whole district. So we need to have a dialogue about that and come up with something that as a community you're comfortable with so that we do it right from the beginning. So we're going to try to dovetail those things and work initially on public space and streetscape so that we can inform their process and come up with that before anything else. Allocation of space on the sidewalk, like for instance, how much room do you give to sidewalk dining and that sort of thing will be something that we'll look at as well. Also materials and furnishings, lights, brick, whatever. Screening of parking is also very important on a public streetscape, and signage is very important as well, and that would be both public and private signage. We did this cross-section, and of course it's important to understand that this cross-section is very conceptual. It shows you what you have now on the left, and then it removes the bump outs and makes the sidewalks wider on Main Street to allow the possibility of having sidewalk dining, which is very important to making a downtown livable. Yes. This is some boards that I did for Goldsboro when we were working on that project. And it just shows, the kind of things that we'll probably see from the designers of the streetscape that show, not obviously these things, but these kinds of things. That you can use brick, and there's different colors, and these different kinds of benches that you might want to consider, and different species of trees, and so on and so forth. And then sidewalk dining, which we already addressed. How far out can you come, and how do you define your space? Do you have to take it in every night? Can you leave it up permanently? There's all kinds of things that need to be discussed. Signs and banners are also very important. The three pictures on the left are private signage. So that's one area. That's the signs that on the building, the name of the store. In the middle, on the upper there, there's actually a mural that's a sign for that store. That's in Greenville, South Carolina, I believe. And, are you going to allow those? And if you did, they would have to be approved before they were put up. On the lower side, the projecting signs, those are great historic elements. They can be very attractive. They would also, all of these would need to be approved. But the other thing that I'd like to add to this, because I forgot to put a picture in yesterday, is neon. Because if you look at historic pictures of Main Street from the 20s, almost every large use had a neon sign. So that's very, very much a part of Danville's history, and I think it would be great. Personally, you can disagree with me, of course, but I think it would be great if we revived that tradition. On the right-hand upper there, you have a directory. This is actually at one of those new open-air malls. This is one of the first that was built. It's up in Maryland. And I took a lot of pictures of it to show to all my small city and town clients, because I said, this is what you have to compete with now. You know, you have an historic downtown, and these people built a fake historic downtown where everything's clean and neat and has little sculptures and everything. It is your new competition. So you got to be at least as good as that, and plus you have to, if you honor your history in addition, you've got the edge over them by a long way. And then the other issue is signage, and this little drawing here at the bottom, this shows banners, but we'll also talk in general terms. You know, I'm not going to design the signage, but I'll talk about where it would go and what it should convey and that sort of thing. Banners also will be part of the design guidelines. Parking and screening, very important. You have some great examples here. This is Bridge Street, and that's a gorgeous wall, perhaps a little tall for what it's accomplishing, but it is beautiful. I generally like a slightly shorter wall because you can see over it so that you feel more secure. Sometimes with a taller wall, you feel like somebody could be hiding back there, and that can be a little disturbing if it's at night. You have to deal with things like where you put the trash and what it looks like and whether it's high quality and so on and so forth. That's very important. It doesn't, you know, people don't like to think about that stuff, but it is important. Also things that you need to think about are drive-throughs. There's rules for drive-throughs, like, you know, they can't occur in the front. Maybe they can only occur on an inside side, but you would prefer them to be in the back, those sorts of things. It's good to set up standards for those so you don't have a more vehicular-oriented street. And this is an example of a hedge here, and this is a lower wall on a project that I worked on. Okay, so design principles. The introductory section discusses good design, and an example of that would just be things like this. It's a general discussion. It's similar for most towns, and it just talks about why you're doing it and what it's supposed to accomplish. Mixed uses, pedestrian priority, contextual and regional architecture that means something to the place where it occurs. Appropriate architecture, well, you have almost endless examples of that here. This is, let me just go back here. This is one of my favorite sections of your downtown. Those are lovely little buildings there, and they're a nice little set, you know. And a great example in the Farrell building is going to be another one that's coming along very soon. And different types. It's interesting that you have such a wide array of types, although the age of these buildings is somewhat similar. And then you have incompatible architecture. And we'll provide an explanation of what makes a building compatible or incompatible, and it has a lot to do with size and fenestration and window rhythm and all kinds of things. You can build a modern building that's clearly modern and still make it fit within the context, or you can make it stand out like a sore thumb. Appropriate materials, they have many examples of that here, and some that are not so great. There's some things that you can, you talk about, we'll have rules for, say, fences and walls. This is an appropriate wall, like a cinder block wall is not appropriate. Brick is appropriate. Wrought iron is appropriate, so on and so forth. So we'll show pictures of good and bad so that people get a clear idea about that. But chain link anywhere along a road or visible, not good. Barbed wire, worse. Those have to go away. And, no screening, that sort of thing. Little tiny narrow sidewalk, and then who'd want to walk there? I ask you. So historic building rehabilitation, we'll show examples of good and bad on that, mostly good. And we'll define it for people, because lots of people buy old buildings and they don't really understand the mechanics of it. So part of the job of design guidelines is to explain that to people. And you do that with things like this, like drawings that show, just names all the parts and talks about transparency at the ground floor for retail buildings, that sort of thing. What's the appropriate place for a sign? You'll get people who buy a building like that and they want to put a sign on the top of the building, like up above the cornice. They want a big sign. No, that's not going to happen. And here's an example that you'll get with a historic district sometimes. This building on the left here is really a modern building. It's not an historic building at all, but it's in an historic district. And because of the guidelines and a fairly sensitive owner, this is what it turned out to look like. Pretty big change, pretty dramatic. So it doesn't have to just be historic buildings that can look really good and really add to your district. So if you have infill, you can do it right. Of course, transparency on the ground floor. You know, you'll have a storefront church or a office use, lawyers or something, and they're going to want to brick up that storefront. No, no, no. That's a no-no. Not in a historic district. Guidelines for new buildings. How new buildings should fit into the historic context and into the area into areas without much context, and that's an interesting problem for this particular challenge. And as I said before, I think that the way to approach it is form-based rather than use. You know, like you don't talk about residential buildings, you don't talk about office buildings, you talk about size and design. And what the uses are doesn't matter so much. And you use that with examples like this. This is on the right here is in New Bern, and this is actually a page from the New Bern Design Guidelines that talks about new buildings and rhythm and so on and so forth, which are the elements that you need to be concerned with new buildings. These two here are historic buildings, and this is a new building, and you can see how the cornice line is the same across here. Even though the building is 1 story higher, it's set back so that it more gracefully fits into the context. And there is the possibility, and I think this is especially along Memorial Drive, that we might consider that area what we call community service. I mean, maybe on the south side of Memorial Drive, you know, not near the 100% corner, but down near the White Mill, maybe that would be appropriate for some services. As you get more and more people living in the downtown area, they're going to need services. They're going to need a grocery store. They're going to need things like that. A gas station. There's no gas station downtown. Well, maybe there is, and I just don't know where it is. So you can do that, and you can do it with quality, and that's the goal, is if you're going to put those things in there, you can put them in, but they don't have to look like most of them look. So this is what a lot of corridors look like. And so simple drawings like this can kind of convey the feeling that usually on these kind of corridors you have parking everywhere, wide driveways, no trees, terrible signage, and ugly buildings. Does that cover it? Well, no. And trash that's just out there where you can see it. So what do you do about that? And here are your examples right here in downtown Danville. So, you know, and every city has these because you don't know what to do with this kind of use. So Danville is not unique this way. But it is a problem, and it is one we have to solve over the long term if you want to upgrade the area. So this drawing is basically the same drawing as the first one, only showing how to do it right, which is screening parking, putting parking in the rear or in between buildings and in the interior of the block rather than right along the curb, having sidewalks. Sometimes that's something that isn't present. Having trees, and having buildings that might have a roof line instead of being flat roofed, that sort of thing, and also putting the trash at the rear so that you don't have to see it when you drive by. Simple things. And these are just some examples of corridors that and how they could be improved in different areas that I've worked in. This is a little site plan here that talks about all these principles and how you would see them in a sort of isometric. And then the old trash question again. Another example. And then this is the end. The next steps, except for your comments, of course. I do need your input, and you know, send comments to David, or we'll post my email address, because sometimes these things take a little thought to really figure out how to do them. But remember that the guidelines are not item or site specific, but are meant to help citizens and investor understand the direction and quality goals of the River District. And there are still issues to be resolved regarding specific areas and administration of the guidelines.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the City Update. Again, we value your input for this design guide, so feel free to give us a call at the office of the city manager or shoot us an email with those ideas. And again, we're very excited for the happenings here in the River District in 2012, as again the streetscape improvements along Main Street will be starting up very soon. And of course, we've got a lot of happenings. The Danville Regional Foundation has opened up their doors here on Bridge Street. Averett University's moved in. We've got a couple of new restaurants opening, some new housing in the district. So a lot is happening here in this area. It's really transforming the city of Danville, and we're looking forward to a prosperous 2012 here in the River District. And this design guide will just fall right in there and kind of give us a roadmap so we can make this district as beautiful as possible as we continue to grow here in the city of Danville. So until next week, have a great day.